everyone, and welcome to another episode of Hot Topics. It is wonderful to be back with you, and we are so excited to be able to record again, even if Hot Topics looks a little bit different. I think we've all learned to adapt a lot in the last 18 months, and it's always wonderful to be able to explore different and new avenues of being able to do God's work and do the discussions that we find are so important for the work that's being done by the church, but also the people of God in the spaces that they are, wherever they are. So we're really excited. We want to welcome everyone once again back to Hot Topics. Tonight we actually start a new series called A New Justice, and it's a wonderful one to be starting at as we engage in our July Justice Month here at Gracepoint. It's always a time where we focus on what does justice mean for us as a church, but also what does justice mean for the church. And with us all being at home in our spaces and everything moving more to the virtual and the online spaces, it's a wonderful time for us to also jump in on that and explore a different platform. As well as that, we've also looked at what does justice mean in an era and an age where everything we do is impacted by the online space. And so that's where we start off tonight. But before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our co-host for tonight. We've got Zina Misimang joining us, and I'll allow Zina to introduce herself. Zina, we're so excited to have you joining us as a guest host, and we're really looking forward to having you. So please tell us about yourself.
Hi, Ilsa. Thank you so much for having me on board as a co-host. I'm very, very excited to venture on this journey with you guys and continue to unpack certain conversations. It's always so beautiful to have these certain conversations and start bringing understanding to churches and people outside of churches as well. Just as Ilsa said, my name is Zina. I've been a congregation member of Grace Point for all of my life, basically. I'm mostly an artist, a singer, songwriter, actress, and presenter. I do spend most of my time on online spaces, obviously because of what I do for a living. And yeah, I'm really, really keen to be here today, and I'm very, very excited to get going with the topic that we have at hand. And I am joined by Utsile and Barry, as well as Shoni as well, who's going to be joining us on our panel. And I'm really, really looking forward to just unpacking what it means to be involved in the online spaces. So without further ado, I think we can get started with this conversation. And Barry and Otsile, specifically, I wanted you guys to unpack exactly what your life looks like with the online space is concerned.
Sorry, me first or Chile?
Sorry, any one of you can go first.
Okay, well, I think we're all aware that in the last 3 years, probably the biggest change that we've had to deal with is not having fellowship and not being able to meet people directly face to face, and it's had a huge impact on the way that we do church, but also the way that young people engage with their world outside and the way they react to it. So I've been busy for probably the last 3 years since my retirement is looking at our youth engage with the media and with the society in terms of their lifestyle choices.
Yeah, thanks. Perhaps I can also add, I don't have the privilege that Baron have of having retired. I'm still in active duty as an attorney in legal practice, as a congregant at Gracepoint. And so for me, the online space has become at the center of what we do. The last 18 months, we've had to practice from our homes. The law firm space requires people to work together in a big office. We don't do that anymore. We're at home. And church requires us to congregate together. We haven't done that as much as we would have liked in the last 18 months. It's been on and off. So the digital space has become important. More and more social issues are ventilated through the online platform. And guess what? Even the courts are hearing matters online and handing judgments online.
Yeah, I do definitely think that the online space is shaping and shifting and is becoming broader because this is our new normal now. Obviously, with COVID's concern, we have to find different ways to converse and have these conversations and gather together. Although personally, for me, with even being online so much because of what I do, I am still struggling with this virtual relationship that I have to have with friends and family all over the world. And I must say, it has been a difficult time in just trying to navigate what it means for us as a society now, because I know that we are a country of love and passion and physical touch and all that kind of stuff. So I know that moving into a virtual space can be sometimes a little bit difficult for people to kind of understand and things like that. So but Celia, I wanted to actually direct this question at you because obviously now that you've introduced yourself, you're saying you're in the practicing of law.
Yes.
And so with that being said, how would you say that having an online space or being a part of conversations online has changed for you or has shifted for you in your practice?
Yeah. So I suppose a useful place to start is that the way the law works is to regulate human behavior. That's the very thrust of why the law exists. And because for the last howsoever many thousands of years, human beings have interacted actually, the laws were also set up to regulate actual human interaction. But with the advent of the internet and everything going online and the digitization of relationships and everything, the law is now slowly adapting to regulating human conduct virtually. And social media, I suppose, is probably the one area that is moving so fast that the law is lagging behind, but really trying to come in. And so at the moment is regulating it reactively as opposed to proactively.
I think you make a very interesting point, Itsile. Thank you for that. Cloney, with your experience in the church space, I know there's a lot of people that have now been saying, why is the church getting involved in online matters? Should the church be getting involved in online matters? And Barry, with your research, you are looking at the trends that people are doing online. How is this impacting our youth specifically? What are your thoughts about the church in the digital space?
Well, I think the first thing we have to define is what do we want to use that digital space for? Because the nature of the digital space is that it's so multifunctional that we can get lost in what we're really doing. And I think that what I'm finding is that, and if you look at the research out there, one of the biggest problems that we've experienced in the last, it's not 18 months, it's just been speeded up in the last 18 months. In the last 3 years, what's happened is that as we have more internet connectivity and more bandwidth, what's happening is that we can actually access more and more regularly. As a result of that, it's been referred to today. The internet has been referred to almost as the additional sense. So we've got feeling, touch, smell, etc. But what's happened is that the virtual space has interacted with experience, because what's tended to happen is that experience is being overtaken by evidence. Now, that should be interesting from a legal point of view, is that for many young people today, just because I see it and it's evidenced on the network or on the net or on media means that it's actually, I've experienced it, which is not truly the case, because we're not engaging mind, body, and also the experience of our senses. So what's happened and why we need to look at the digital space very carefully as a church is because the virtual space actually structures our context. Virtual is not reality. And for that reason, whatever we do virtually in a church should also provide the opportunity for experience which the virtual and digital space doesn't provide. And because of that, there's been an enormous amount of polarization, not only in society, but also between faiths.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Barry, for that. And else, I think just from the church's side, I think for me there are three important things. The first is obviously the space that many churches have been able to explore, and that is how do we bring services? It's really given us an opportunity. I remember if you spoke 2 years, 3 years back in youth ministry circles, we would tell you that as a church, we only have 52 hours access. I mean, yeah, we can only access teenagers or children with our content for 52 hours a year, because we were working on the assumption that every person comes to a church once a week on a Sunday, and then it's that 1 hour program, and then 52 Sundays a year. So literally, that's how much content we could give, and then maybe, hopefully, if they also come during the week, you could then double that 52. And then we were literally we're trying to outweigh the impact of society, the content that society offers, with 104 hours a year, which is impossible. There is no way you can do that. And for the first time, what internet actually offers us as a church is an opportunity to actually increase those hours, because now you can literally just upload something, and if a young person is interested, and right now, I've seen people share stuff of Stephen Furtick, from Elevation Church, people that I never even thought go to church, so access has been increased. So for me, that's the one positive thing. But the stuff that we still need to wrestle with as a church. Now, I'm a youth pastor at Gracepoint, which follows the Wesleyan tradition. And one of the things that is very close to our hearts is the idea of social holiness. Now, if you're going to speak about social holiness, you can't ignore social issues. Now, if I'm going to speak about social issues, then the question is, how do Christians take part in this idea of perpetuating social issues through social media? We've seen so many issues around justice, surfacing because of social media for the first time. We look at what's happening with the political unrest in South Africa. We feel like we've got access to more information than we've had in the past. And even though then there's some problematic content, then I suppose then the church's responsibility is one, how do we guide Christians on how to filter out information? What is true, what isn't? How do we create communities in our churches where we've got access to legal experts? So how do we create a community where Otile can say, this is what's true about case X, Y, and Z, and this is what's not true, so I'm avoiding to call particular cases by name. But how do we create those communities? How do we create communities where Barry can say, because I had this beautiful conversation with Barry, for instance, where he said to me, Khuni, if I hold up a plastic on a screen, you can only assume it's a plastic. You can't touch it. You cannot, I'm basically relying on the person who's holding the plastic on the screen. So creating those communities where we can filter out what's fake and what's true, because we've seen how much that can have an impact on what happens in society. An example, the whole issue around COVID-19 and the vaccines. But also then another responsibility that then comes in as a church is, how do we also guide our members to participate in online communities? Are they canceling out people? Are they demonizing people without facts? Are they Are they sending out fake news? Are we polarizing where it's not necessary to polarize? So all in all, social media, like any other space, is this place with problematic elements, but it is still this world that God loves so much that he sent his only son to die for it. And so we need to be part of it, but in a way that is counterculture where it's necessary. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight on that, Sony. I think from this perspective, I must say it for our generation, it is a difficult time to try and navigate what the social media space entails and all the information that we get given. I mean, on a daily basis, we are constantly finding out different things on what's happening in different countries and different worlds and things like that. So it's becoming a lot more difficult to navigate the type of content that we're getting. And also, someone mentioned to me the other day that my Instagram feed, for example, all the information that I'm getting and all the content that I'm getting is completely different to another person, because it's dependent on who you follow and things that you like and all that kind of stuff, I guess, in a sense. So it becomes difficult to navigate that kind of, content consumption as a young person, because there's so much information that is just being given to us. So just, Otsile, from your side, I wanted to find out, when it comes to receiving certain information with the countries concerned, obviously, Tony has just mentioned the unrest that's happening with all that. where do we even begin to start as individuals? Where do we begin to start having those conversations, or making the rest of the world aware on our social media platforms? How do we do that in a way that is informative and educational, and not in a way that is bringing down either side of where people may stand?
I suppose the first place to start is to recognize the speed with which social media delivers information to people and the need for people to disseminate that information with speed. And so we have become like processing machines. Information comes into your social media platforms and there's an urge to take it out as soon as you get it, so that you are seen to be in the know and to be part of something greater than you. And that's the first problem, because we don't pause to think. And because we don't pause to think, we become unintended participants in potentially problematic things. So the first thing that we've got to remember and think through as young Christians, as adult Christians, is that not everything that comes into your account should leave your account. So that's the first thing. Not everything that comes in should leave. The second thing is that some of the people who we interact with and who send us stuff don't know our view of things. So we have an opportunity for ministry by, instead of forwarding their stuff, engaging them on the appropriateness of their stuff. And the third thing is to remember that the traffic we see on social media has legal consequences. I'll give you one example. If I send a hate speech tweet and you see that tweet, you read it, you like it, you retweet it, I'm committing a crime called hate speech. By retweeting it, you are committing a separate crime of hate speech. So one's got to be careful.
Thank you so much for that, Atile. I think that's such a powerful point that you raised, that sometimes we are unaware that we are actually involved in activities that we don't necessarily want to be involved in. I think what makes the church and the community of God and the online space so difficult is that we don't necessarily have a set of commandments for social media. It doesn't anywhere say don't retweet something that is hate speech, or don't moan about your boss on social media. But we do have texts that really help us in terms of loving one another. And how can we take this idea and these principles that we have as Christians and apply them to these new contexts that we are now exposed to? One of the things that you've touched on a little bit, and that's been coming a lot more in our online spaces, is this idea of social media mob lynching. And really what this is where people are almost like, to use a biblical term, crucifying each other on social media, where someone will make a mistake, or a mistake will come to light, and people are ruthless in really crucifying this person and lynching them. I've recently, and this kind of translates a little bit more to the real realm, which you touched on, Barry, how our experience online can impact our experience in reality. A case where fake information was shared on social media in India, and a man was actually beaten to death by a community based on that social media that had been spread. And it was truly a fake account. And it's just scary to hear how there's so many pros to social media in terms of getting news out and getting everyone aware of what's happening, screen discipleship, things like that, but also the very real negatives. And this kind of puts us in an ethical dilemma as Christians online now. How do we start to navigate situations like this where people are being persecuted online? What are some things that we can do? What are some ideas that you've come across that are helpful? Maybe you can kick us off, Barry.
Yeah, I think the thing to remember here is that we need to actually simplify this a little to understand it, and that's really part of the research that I've done, is to say, but why is this happening? What are some of the fundamentals of it? And one of the things I mentioned just before I ended this issue, that over the last 3 years there's been incredible polarization, and there's polarization, and it can be, if I want to say, simplified down to the fact that there's happy news and there's unhappy news. Now the point is that what part of that happy do you want to be, the unhappy news or the happy news? If you take it a step further and you say, okay, well, let's define what the good stuff is that we like to hear and what the other stuff is that we like to watch because it's so entertaining. It might be unhappy stuff, but it still engages us. So if we take it one step up, what we find is that you actually have on social media, you have resentment content and you have what we call the aspirational content. If you take those two sides and you start bringing that back to the truth, you see that what social media does and the AI in social media is if you start looking at negative stuff about somebody, it's going to feed you that. So what it does is it exacerbates that whole issue. If you look at the other side, which is more positive, it's going to feed you that. But it never shows you the middle ground. Now, that's where I believe the church belongs. If you consider that you've got a glass full of marbles and you try and pour water in it, in fact, the glass might be full of marbles, but it still accepts water. Now, that's a water of life. That's the stuff we learn spiritually, is that there's a lot of space in between. And it's that space in between that we have to explore. I call it the liminal space, but it's defined by a simple word, which is truth. Now, as a church, we can decide, are we going to be part of the marbles, or what I call the bait balls of opinion, the extremes on either side, or are we going to occupy that space that seeks truth? Now, if that's what we can do, and that truth normally lies in the area of comfort and happiness. The other things that are in the marbles, the bait balls of people and of opinion, is where all of the extreme stuff is that makes people anxious. And one of the issues that we have to be very, very careful of is language, because this issue that you refer to as mob lynching is a tactic that has been used for many, many years called intellectual intimidation. And on social media, it's so easy because you'll post a comment and then somebody will send something back and it baffles you. You think to yourself, what on earth is this about? I didn't mean it this way. It's because we've offered a comment without context. So what social media does is it strips context from our comments. And if we're going to be a church, that context has to be filled with what is in the Word, with the truth of the Word. So at the end of the day, it's important for us to understand that mob lynching is just a way of baffling people. They then get embarrassed because they feel they've said something that's not meaningful because there's been no context. And what they do is then they withdraw. And in fact, what that has also done is it's lynched the idea, not necessarily the person. And because of that, it's referred to then as unpersoning the context, the context, which is very, very sad. And that's why we get the cyberbullying, because it's a form of that. So this mob lynching is something that I'm pleased we're talking about, because it's different to the cancel culture, and in some very, very subtle ways.
Thank you so much for that, Barry, for that insight on that. And just as you were speaking, I kind of started thinking about, you were saying with obviously taking in content and what type of content should the church be putting out there, and where should they stand within that middle ground and stuff. So Hloni, just to get your understanding on it, where should the church stand essentially when it comes to content? Because on that part as well, it's very easy for us to as people, because let's not forget that people also make up the congregation of the church, and just as we are people, we do make mistakes. There are ways in which we're also trying to learn and understand the different information that we're getting. But as a church leader, so youth pastor specifically, where does the church stand in terms of the content that they receive, and what do they do with the content that they've received? And on top of that, when it comes to being a church of justice and equality and understanding that there's different parties that play in the different types of content that we get, and also the context of the content that we're receiving.
Sure. Thank you, Seeps. So maybe let me start off by saying one of the things we will be exploring in the third week of this series is the idea of echo chambers, being in communities that only resound your own noise. And then the reason I'm mentioning that is one of the things that has made me personally comfortable with disagreeing with people and holding different ideas is a moment in my life where I lived with someone for 2 years with a family where the father said to me that, Hloni, I still struggle with racism. And I am looking forward to the journey ahead. 30 years of my life, I've been told that white is superior and black is inferior. And I cannot undo that in just 5 years. There are ideas still in my head that come up time and again, and I call myself out. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because as the church, I strongly believe we need to create such honest spaces where people are not lynched for being honest about what they're still struggling with. For me, you cannot create spaces of repentance where people cannot be honest about ideologies and things they still struggle with. And we need to do the same when it comes to online spaces. I strongly believe, even when it comes to online spaces, there needs to be times when we genuinely say, so perhaps differing maybe a bit from, not, so I agree with the idea of creating those liminal spaces of truth, as Barry has said, but at the very same time, I want to take that same example and say, if we say means towards social progression are those marbles, when those marbles have been placed on one side of the jar, the water will automatically flow onto the other. And there is a sense in which we are then called to say, we are meant to find out what is the truth of the marginalized. So for instance, if we've got 16 days coming now, I cannot then, as the church, say man and woman both matter. And so as the church during 16 days, we're going to speak about both men and women. No, it's against gender-based violence, and people who are victims of gender-based violence, who are usually victims of gender-based violence in South Africa and in the world across, is women. So at that particular moment, as polarizing as it may sound, and it may be, I am going to focus on women. I'm not going to focus on men and women when we are speaking about issues of abuse. And so it is the same around issues of justice. It is the same around issues of race. What we need to do, what we have not done as the church, which is catching up with us on the online space, we have not created honest spaces. I've had the privilege, I've had two of these, in actual fact, three of these conversations with one with a lecturer of mine, the other with the man I just told you about, who I lived, and I've got a very good relationship with him. I refer to him as Uam. And then the third one with a senior minister I served under. And the first conversation we had, or maybe not the first, but one of the most defining conversations we had was where we were honest about our struggles. And they said to me, Hloni, this is what I've known. This has been my truth for 30 years. And that cannot be undone with a snap of a finger. And so we need to create those spaces, even on social media. For me, we still need to create those spaces because we cannot compromise people who are still marginalized because we have not created those spaces. For me, what is lacking is that we need to create these spaces where people do not feel condemned because of what is being spoken about at that particular moment, but they understand that they are part of the same kingdom. And so that's it for me. And maybe just to end of Zina, just to kind of wrap it up, from my side in response to what you said, as a young person, I do not get offended when they speak about issues around GBV because I understand that it implicates my mother, it implicates my sister. And perhaps it is also that relationship that allows me to embrace that space and allow those 16 days, or rather allow myself to be vulnerable during those 16 days and call myself out around behavior that also perpetuates gender-based violence, one, because I understand that we belong in the same kingdom with these people. But also, number two, we've got to create honest spaces where people are honest about where they stand, where people wrestle with issues, where we say we don't have it figured out, and people are not cancelled because they hold a different view. And then number three, I think, just as the church, when it comes to content, then also we need to say, as far as this content goes, what is the aim? We do not just call out for the sake of calling out in a church. We call out in order to realize the kiss between mercy and grace. I mean, mercy and justice. So as much as there's going to be justice, but how are we restoring the man in our community? Whereas the world just says that there's going to be justice and that's it. We say there's going to be justice, but we also need to restore the relationship between men and women. And for me, those are some of the things we employ in sharing content as a church.
Sure, Tony. I think it's a very powerful thing that you've raised there about the balance of grace and mercy, as well as truth and justice. And as with our Methodist belief, we often believe that there has to be a balance of grace and truth. There's this book that I've been reading recently by Dr. Henry Cloud, who speaks about this balance of grace and truth. And the book is called Changes That Heal. And what are those changes that we need to make to our society, to our own lives, and to any space that we interact with, for example, the digital space, to enable healing to come as well as truth. And he speaks about this idea that if there isn't a balance between grace and truth, we miss the mark either way. If there's too much grace, we have a society where there's no rules, there's no truth, everyone is just rogue. But if there's too much truth and no grace, we have people that are broken with no sense of reconciliation, redemption, or healing. And so we need to find those spaces of grace and truth even on those spaces. Now, my question is, how do we find those spaces of grace and truth on social media? What makes this balance so difficult on social media, especially with the topic of social media mob lynching? Often what happens with this mob lynching is somebody, as we've all mentioned, somebody will reveal or speak without thinking. They will give an honest opinion, but there is no sense of grace to hold them. Yes, we need to hold them accountable, but to hold them in a space where they're able to be reconciled to the truth of Jesus in that situation. I don't believe that God, the story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery, where Jesus invites her to this journey and invites her persecutors to this journey of both grace and truth, to say, yes, there needs to be truth, but there needs to be grace. How do we find ourselves in this, especially on social media? How do we find a space where there can be both grace and truth? And I want to open up that question to everyone on the panel today. How do we find this balance of grace and truth? Practically speaking, abstract speaking, please speak from your own experience, your own research. The floor is yours.
Perhaps I can jump in first. That way I can say a few things and then leave co-panelists to add some more. For me, one of the vital cores of finding the balance is through social regulation. And being a lawyer, the way I know to do it is through the law. And just to remind ourselves, how has our own country, South Africa, tried to strike that balance? In section 16 of our constitution, we've got a very wonderful right to the so-called freedom of expression. So that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. But the beauty of that constitution is that it's very clear that these rights, including the freedom of expression, are not absolute. These rights need to be balanced one with the other. And so, in as much as I have the freedom to express my honest opinion, and I do have that freedom, if doing so is going to harm the right to dignity of someone else, I may not express it because that expression is unconstitutional. And there's another myth that perhaps I wanted to deal with. I very often hear in debate in this country, people say, but that is my honest opinion, so I have the right to express it. The fact that an opinion is honest does not make it truthful or factual. Because remember, an opinion is just an expression of a judgment or a view, not necessarily based on fact or truth. So that's the first important thing that I thought I would deal with. The second thing that I thought is absolutely critical to understand is that no society can thrive where the voice of the individual is suppressed. So the state has to give every individual the ability to be free to articulate their thoughts and views, but to do so within the prescripts of the law. My last point, when you overlay on the legal space some of the values that we as Christians live by, in addition to something being constitutional, Christians have an additional duty. You can't simply express things because they are constitutional. I have the right to say something, therefore I say it. Am I in the pursuit of grace? Am I helping the less fortunate? Am I informing people that need information in order to improve their lives? Or am I informing people in order to steer them into mob psychology that leads to the destruction of the economy like we've seen in the last week? We don't have the right to spare destruction. We have the right to spare reconstruction and development.
Sure. That is something to think about and to process. I think what what I think in the world, or rather in South Africa, I would say that we do need, which is something that Shlomi touched on briefly, and something that you've also mentioned, Ottilia, as well. I think it is so important, which is something I also want to bring into the panel as well as we continue to discuss this as well. The difference between, or rather, the new word, which is normalizing, canceling, and call out. Although I think it is very, very important to have these conversations, something that you'd mentioned before, and it's very, very important to understand the side in which you stand on and being able to, see the perspective of another person. How far do we go in terms of understanding that person's perspective? Because we are well within what's it the freedom state that we're in this country. We are well outside of the days in which Black people were oppressed. So how far do we go in terms of allowing people to still express themselves in a way that is conducive to helping them understand, okay, cool, this was my understanding in the past, I now need to change. We're well into, I think, 2 decades now of freedom. So where do we now have that line where it's like, okay, cool, I can have this conversation with this person, but how far are we letting it go? How many times is a person allowed to make those mistakes and continuously have those thoughts in their minds? Because what I do feel is that over time, if you continue to think something and feel something, at some point it's going to come out in a sense of rage. And that's what we've seen on social media, is that people are finally finding their voices. And Otile, you did mention obviously having the right to freedom of speech, which I think is very, very, very important. So in what you were saying, Otile, in a sense that like, where where do we draw the line? Because we want to be able to open up ourselves and in having those conversations. We want to be able to create a society where there is a sense of grace and a sense of truth. But how far do we go in terms of normalizing someone saying, oh, I have been struggling this for a very long time, and or saying, okay, cool, this is now you've come out with this. There is grace for that. But then what is the process in healing? Are you practicing that healing? Are you having more conversations? If something does happen and you do have a burst of emotion, is that okay? Where does I don't know if you guys understand the question, but where does the line between normalizing something, canceling something, or calling out on something, where does the church stand in that line?
Steeps, maybe I'll just kick in because I know Barry's also got some brilliant stuff. I've actually read a couple of his articles around these kind of topics, which have been very helpful. I think the first thing for me, Ms. Pogazi, is that um, one of the things that the Barna research, the recent Barna study on Gen Z speaks about, is the importance of discipling young people towards being counterculture. Right. So it goes back to that whole idea of saying we are in the world, but we're not of the world. We're not going to retreat into some desert and try to live in our own world or create church only Christians only apps and not engage the world. We need to engage the world. We need to engage social issues. We're not preparing young people to be Christians within the church. We're preparing young people to be Christians within the world. And so it is very important. And so in us doing that, one, we need to guide young people towards being countercultural. Towards being countercultural. And what does this mean in an online space? If there's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie writes very beautifully about this concept of the prevailing ideological orthodoxy on any digital space. That there is this idea which is the prevailing ideology in that space. It is the orthodoxy of the day. And if you fall out of it, if you do not subscribe to it, you can be called out, you can be cancelled, you can be kicked out. And now this is dangerous because it is created by exclusive groups. What Barry's touched on in his previous opinion, in his previous input, where he was saying you've got AI that manipulates what eventually appears on your feed. If I subscribe to this, and over time, if I subscribe to a particular ideology, all I end up with on my feed is a particular ideology. And then that becomes the world that I live in. And the danger of that is that it is creating exclusive communities. And I would not be surprised to see it breed a new generation of nationalists, toxic nationalism, where people only belong and account to their own and no one else outside of that group. If you do not agree with the ideology of this group, you are not part of us. That is the danger of it, that you and I can be on the same social media platform and yet be in completely different groups. On it at the same time in completely different groups. Now, to get back to what you're saying, one, I think we need to teach young people to be countercultural within the different communities they find themselves in. When someone is being cancelled, when someone is being publicly lynched, and someone is being ridiculed for their ideas, am I going to go on and sing along, or am I going to stand against this? When someone differs, has a differing opinion, am I going to take the biblical route of saying, I think Otino also touched on this, of saying, let me DM this person, let us pick up on this conversation, because I know if I actually challenge them on their timeline, they'll be defensive. And all we're going to have is this fruitless debate because this person is now defending their personality, their profile. So let me give them a call because I've got access to them. But then number three, we've got to be intentional in establishing relationships. Something that South Africans often miss is that relationships require intention. I've got a friend who mailed me on Friday who sent me a Facebook inbox with a presentation that she did for a conference in another country on the issue and she's a white lady, and she was speaking about race issues, and she said, Hloni, please look at this, help me keep my whiteness in check. Those were her words. We are intentional in holding that relationship. It's important for both her and I, because she helps me keep some stuff in check. If I'm writing something that I'm like, this seems a bit radical and people might misinterpret what I'm saying, I inbox her and I'm saying, please check this out, other people like that in my life. And so for me, I think those are three key things: being countercultural, challenging the people in your exclusive group, being intentional in breaking out of the group and having other people who might subscribe to other ideologies, and being intentional about those relationships. So for me, those are very important things, Zina. And then you'll be able to say, if someone's like, I'm struggling with issues around sexism, you can engage them in a way that is more constructive and challenge them where it's needed. But you have allowed yourself to not only, crucify people, but also to coexist with people and interact with people who hold differing opinions and ideas.
Thank you so much for that, Hloni. Thank you. And Barry, just from your side, just if you have anything to add on from what Hloni said, and how better can an individual begin to unpack these conversations that they want to have with different people, whether it's bringing up an argument or a specific topic from a social media perspective, from a virtual perspective, in an online space. How can we as individuals be better at bringing up conversations, helping each other in terms of understanding, normalizing, being able to, call out in a way that's not public, but more in a way that is conducive to, okay, cool, this is how I'm feeling about this. Where am I wrong? Where can my understanding be shifted? Where can I unlearn and where can I relearn?
I think you need to understand First of all, it might be a longer answer than you want, but I think that we need to understand that in South Africa, unlike other youths throughout the world, we have a youth that are incredibly, I call them shapeshifters, that they are very, very astute and we're very well skilled in jumping from one cultural realm to another. Today they can be in the workspace and they'll be living one culture. Tomorrow they'll be with their grannies in their traditional home and they'll be living a different culture. They'll go to church and they'll live another culture. You just have to look at some people's Instagram. So the question you're asking really comes down to having a very, very clear understanding that our youth are driven by intent. You used the word Shloni. We have to understand and we have to be very intentional about the way we communicate and when and in what context we deal with our shape-shifting youth. The one thing that is always anchored any youths or any culture is their culture. So you'll find people that are, for instance, are very, very modern, especially young ladies. They go to the Reed dance. You get a lot of young men who you wouldn't imagine working in a law practice, maybe even going or having their children go to the circumcision ritual. So, you have to understand that people navigate different realms of their life. Church is just one of those. It's a spiritual element of their life. And the way that we make that comfortable for them as a community, as being part of a community, comes down to the relationship we have with them. So how do we do that? I think the first thing is that we have to understand that today people, young people, the worst thing that can happen to them is not to belong. And this is why they bait ball. This is why they hop from one opinion to the other. And that's why I always say the role that we play is, first of all, to be very careful of our language. One word can destroy a relationship. I've been called names that have hurt me so deeply, but even within the church, but you just actually have to be strong enough in your faith to say it was somebody's mistake. Now, what gives you that ability to say that was somebody's error? It's forgiveness. It's compassion. It's, but at the same time, the question is, and this is where I agree with Shloni, there's times where you have to challenge people and say, it's honest and not just hunky-dory, If I can use your example, for instance, Shloni, where it comes to the question of the female lives matter. And we're going into that, and for 6 weeks we're going to focus on that. Absolutely. But then don't demonize all men. And that's what we tend to do, is we tend to have this in our language that we use to lift the woman to where we can actually deal with the issues. We say, but men must, without actually, by casting that aspersion on all men. And there are many men that are doing what they can. And that really comes down to two issues. I think, for me, the simplicity of what we have to do for the youth is, first of all, we have to give them a reason to belong. Because if they belong to us, and that's why I think Youth Alpha is just so important, because Youth Alpha is not, youth hate rules. They want to collaborate in creating their own space. And that's what Alpha does. So I think Alpha is a perfect example of how to reach them. It's the whole issue is that we need to get away from this concept of we're going to fix the world. We've got a defective world, because the moment we start preaching that, we're teaching people resentment, because they resent what they have there. They want more. And for that reason, we need to be a church that sits in that space that says, what does a life well lived offer us? And that's what Alpha does. And that's the message that we have to carry through. And the language we use is critical. The woke language is a destructive force that we have to get away from. And it doesn't matter whether they use it on social media, we cannot align with it, because it carries too much baggage for some people, if you talk about Black Lives Matter the way we did last year, without contextualizing it for South Africa, people refer to it in the context that it is in America, which is not the same, or it wasn't the same at the time we were dealing with that on Hot Topic. So that's just it's a long conclusion for a short question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. I really, really value the input that everyone has given us. You've given us a huge amount to think about. I can't even summarize what you've given us because there is so much. And this is a conversation that I will be going back to in future and listening to over, and to just understand the full aspect of everybody's input that you've been able to share with us. As we are out of time, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to keep this conversation going, I think we add so much to it, we're going to have to wrap it up for today. But I think if we were to summarize this conversation, and I just think what everyone has added to this conversation, it would be to say, as Christians, how do we negotiate and how do we navigate this online space in a way that is different, that is countercultural, that is not as the world is? Yes, we need to have truth. Yes, it is important. Yes, we need to have grace. We need to have space of healing. But how do we do it in a way that is flavored by something different? I think of the passages in Matthew where Jesus says, "You are the salt and the light." And so as Christians, our way is a way that is different to those around us. Our way is different. And so how do we as Christians navigate and negotiate these spaces in a way that is the salt and the light? That flavors but also brings healing and reconciliation, but also exposes things that need to be exposed. And so maybe that's a way of us thinking about and closing this conversation. I want to say a very, very big thank you to each of you for being here with us today. Thank you to our tech team as well for making this possible. And thank you to our audience who are supportive in our ministry as Hot Topics. And so we are so grateful to have everyone joining us tonight. We wish you a wonderful week further, and we hope that you'll be joining us for the next Hot Topics conversation, which we will let you know when it'll be happening very soon. And so we pray a blessing of God on you this time and a wonderful week further. Thank you so much.